It began on an ordinary morning in Bengaluru, the kind where the city's chaos had not yet spilled into every lane, and the smell of filter coffee drifted from apartment balconies. But beneath the calm, one man's life was about to be turned upside down by something as absurd as it was humiliating: a discarded parcel, and an apartment association ready to weaponize it. Arjun was a young professional in his late 20s, living in a mid-sized gated community with his girlfriend, Ananya, who often visited on weekends. Like many Bengaluru couples, they balanced demanding IT jobs, relentless traffic commutes, and the constant struggle to keep their personal lives private in a society always eager to peek over the wall. That morning, the housekeeping staff discovered a torn cardboard box in the society's trash area. It was nothing unusual: Amazon packages, Zomato bags, and the endless waste of city living piled there daily. But this one was different. The label hadn't been removed, and right there, in bold letters, was Ananya's full name and address. What should have been meaningless waste became ammunition. Within hours, the HOA committee had called an emergency meeting. They paraded the parcel as evidence that Ananya had spent the night at Arjun's flat without proper registration. In their minds, a guest's discarded package wasn't trash. It was proof of misconduct. By afternoon, Arjun received a notice slipped under his door. It was official-looking, stamped with the association's seal and filled with stiff language. He was being fined for violation of community conduct rules, citing unauthorized guest stays and improper waste disposal. The fine wasn't enormous, 5,000 rupees, but the weight of the accusation felt far heavier. It wasn't just about money. It was about being publicly shamed in front of neighbors, being reduced to a case file in the HOA's ledger of punishments. Arjun felt as though his private life had been pried open with surgical precision, exposed by something as ridiculous as a shipping label. The whispers began almost immediately. Passing neighbors gave curious glances. Security guards smirked as he walked through the gates. For Ananya, it was worse. She wasn't even a resident, yet her name was now etched into the society's gossip mill, framed as a symbol of impropriety. Arjun sat alone that night, staring at the crumpled fine notice. His initial instinct was disbelief. How could anyone take a piece of trash this seriously? But in Bengaluru's rigid apartment communities, rules weren't guidelines, they were weapons. And the HOA had chosen to draw blood. But something inside Arjun shifted that night. What began as a bruise to his pride soon hardened into determination. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. It was about dignity, privacy, and the absurd power of an association that thought it could control the lives of its residents through surveillance and intimidation. And if they wanted a battle over a discarded package, Arjun was ready to give them one. The war between one man and his HOA had just begun. Arjun thought the nightmare was over once he crumpled the first notice and tossed it aside. After all, what could the apartment association really do? It was just a petty fine, born out of spite, and surely it would blow over. But the truth was far uglier. The next morning, as he walked toward the elevator, he saw it. A large white sheet plastered across the lobby notice board. In bold letters, the words screamed at every passerby. Community violation. Resident of flat 804 fined for improper waste disposal. Guest parcel found in common trash area. Below, in smaller but equally damning type, the line read, All residents are reminded that unauthorized overnight guests are against society conduct. It didn't mention Ananya's name. It didn't need to. Everyone in the building already knew whose name was printed on that discarded parcel. By the time Arjun reached the parking lot, Whispers had already spread faster than wildfire. People glanced at him and looked away. Some smirked. Some shook their heads in performative disappointment. A group of teenagers sitting on the boundary. Wall chuckled openly, their laughter echoing down the lane as he walked past. It wasn't just a fine anymore. It was public humiliation. The parcel had turned into a weapon, and the HOA was holding it like a blade pressed against his throat. That evening, Arjun confronted the problem head-on. He dug through his purchase agreement, through the thick folder of documents that had come with the apartment. He searched for the words overnight guest restriction. They weren't there. He searched for unauthorized waste disposal fines. Not there either. What he found instead was a stack of vague, half-written guidelines, rules that gave the association wide control but little legal backbone. There were mentions of cleanliness, community harmony, and maintaining the dignity of the society, but nothing binding, nothing enforceable in court. The more he read, the angrier he became. This wasn't about order or cleanliness. This was about control. The HOA wasn't enforcing rules. They were inventing them, and they were counting on his silence to validate their authority. Ananya, meanwhile, was crushed by guilt. She had never intended for her name to be dragged through gossip networks. In just 2 days, her reputation had been reduced to a one-word label whispered across balconies: the guest. For her, it was unbearable. Bengaluru was her home too, and she had built her career, her friendships, her future in this city. To be reduced to nothing more than the girl with the trash parcel was humiliating beyond measure. She urged Arjun to pay the fine, to put an end to it before things spiraled further. But for him, it was too late. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about dignity. The HOA had crossed a line by making his private life into public spectacle. If he paid, it would only encourage them to tighten the noose, to find new ways to remind him and everyone else that they were the ones in charge. So Arjun stayed firm. Days passed, and the association tightened its grip. Another notice was delivered, this one harsher than the first. It read, "Failure to pay fine will result in suspension of amenities, parking rights, and legal escalation. Residents are warned against ignoring official directives." Legal escalation. That phrase rattled through Arjun's head as he sat on his balcony late into the night, staring at the lights of the city. He knew how these things worked. Bengaluru was full of stories. Stories of apartment associations that overstepped boundaries, misused funds, bullied residents, and silenced opposition. They weren't just a group of neighbors keeping order. They were a miniature empire, ruling through intimidation. And the more Arjun thought about it, the more he realized something. If they could do this to him, they could do it to anyone. The next day, the HOA, the notice went up in the lobby. Monthly association meeting. All residents welcome to attend. It was written in neat block letters, but to Arjun, the words felt more like a summons. He knew his case, the infamous parcel in trash, would be at the center of discussion. He also knew that by walking into that meeting, he'd be stepping directly into the lion's den. But there was no other way. If he stayed silent, the narrative would be theirs forever. He had to show up. That evening, the community hall filled slowly, the way storm clouds gather before a downpour. Plastic chairs scraped against the tiled floor. Ceiling fans whirred lazily, spreading more tension than air. Residents trickled in, families, retirees, bachelors, all of them curious to witness the drama that had become neighborhood entertainment. At the front, on a raised dais, sat the HOA committee. 5 people, shoulders squared, eyes sharp, wearing expressions carved from stone. Their leader, Mrs. Menon, adjusted her glasses and shuffled papers with exaggerated calm. She was a retired principal, known for her icy composure and her ability to silence rooms with a single glance. Beside her sat the treasurer, Mr. Regaven, fingers tapping against a calculator even though there were no numbers to calculate tonight. The others, equally rigid, formed a wall of authority. And then, in the back row, under the flickering tube light, sat Arjun, alone. The meeting began with routine matters: water tank cleaning schedules, new parking stickers, upcoming cultural events. But everyone in the hall knew these were just warm-ups. The real spectacle hadn't started yet. Finally, Mrs. Menon cleared her throat. The room hushed. "Next on the agenda," she announced, "is the matter of waste disposal violations and repeated disregard of society regulations by resident of Flat 804. All eyes turned. Arjun could feel the weight of their gaze. Some looked at him with pity, others with amusement, and some with that smug satisfaction only gossip can provide. Mrs. Menon continued, "We are not here to shame anyone unnecessarily, but rules exist for a reason. When a guest's personal parcel is found in the trash, it is not just about littering, it is about respect for community standards. Overnight stays by outsiders compromise the safety and culture of this society." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the hall. A man in Fadi Toninthi, the second row whispered to his neighbor, not even bothering to lower his voice. "So it's true then. The girl was staying over." The words stung. They weren't directed at Arjun, but they landed like darts nonetheless. Arjun stood up slowly. His chair screeched against the floor, slicing through the whispers. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm was louder than anger. "I've read every clause of the agreement I signed when I bought my flat," he said. "There is no mention of a ban on overnight guests. There is no mention of fines for waste disposal linked to personal parcels. You are enforcing rules that don't exist. You are weaponizing technicalities to shame and control people." The hall fell into a strained silence. Mrs. Menon's face tightened. "Young man, this is not about written clauses. This is about spirit, about discipline. If every resident bends the rules, what becomes of order? What becomes of harmony?" But Arjun didn't flinch. He looked around at the audience. "Ask yourselves," he said. "Today it's me. Tomorrow it could be any of you. If your friend forgets their coffee cup in the lobby, if your child's delivery package ends up in the wrong bin, will you accept your names being posted on a public board? Will you accept humiliation for something that isn't even illegal? Or will you finally realize that this is not order, it is control?" A ripple of unease spread. People shifted in their seats. A few nodded, almost imperceptibly. Others looked down, unwilling to meet his gaze. For the first time, the committee looked unsettled. But then, the treasurer leaned into the microphone. His voice was oily, confident. "Fine words, young man. But here's the reality. You signed a contract giving the association rights to enforce rules as they deem fit. That includes fines. That includes notices. If you refuse, we will escalate to legal action. And once legal fees and penalties pile up, let's see how strong your principles remain." The threat hung heavy in the room. And then, just as Arjun prepared to respond, an unexpected voice rose from the crowd. It was an elderly resident, Mr. Pillai, who had lived in the building since its first brick was laid. His voice trembled with age, but carried the authority of someone who had seen too much to be silenced. "I remember," he said, "when this society was formed. It was meant to protect residents, not punish them. What I see today is not protection. It is bullying. The hall erupted into gasps again. Mrs. Menon banged the table, demanding order. But the seed had been planted. Doubt had crept in. The meeting ended in chaos. No resolution, no consensus, only a vague threat of further review. But as residents dispersed, something had shifted. Conversations that once mocked Arjun now carried curiosity, even sympathy. People who had avoided his eyes now gave him cautious nods. The committee still held power, but for the first time, their authority didn't feel absolute. Arjun walked back to his flat with a strange mixture of exhaustion and resolve. He had taken the first step in fighting back. But he also knew this was far from over. The HOA wasn't used to resistance. They wouldn't take kindly to cracks forming in their control. And he was right, because the very next morning, a new notice appeared in the lobby. Bigger, harsher. And this time, it wasn't just about a fine. It was about eviction. The sun rose over the apartment complex in a pale, muted light. But its warmth never touched Arjun's home that morning. For pinned to the lobby board, in bold red letters, was a notice that chilled him to the bone. Final warning. Resident of Flat 804. Failure to comply with society rules and payment of fines will lead to initiation of eviction proceedings under community bylaws. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It was an ultimatum. Word spread like wildfire. Residents gathered in clusters near the gates, their conversations drifting between outrage and curiosity. Some shook their heads in disbelief. How could the HOA committee threaten to evict a man over a piece of packaging? Others whispered gleefully, relishing the unfolding drama. The complex had become less of a home and more of a theater stage, where every notice was a new act in the play. For Arjun, the notice wasn't merely a piece of paper. It was a weapon aimed at his identity, his dignity, and the very roof over his head. He had grown up in Bengaluru, worked hard to afford this flat, and built his sense of independence within those walls. To lose it over a trumped-up violation felt surreal. But as surreal as it felt, it was also deliberate. The HOA was no longer interested in correcting behavior. They were intent on crushing resistance. Behind the committee's closed doors, strategies unfolded. Mrs. Menon, calm but unyielding, believed that making an example of Arjun was essential. If one resident could openly challenge their authority in a public meeting, what would stop others from following? To her, this wasn't about a parcel anymore, it was about power. The threat of eviction was their strongest card, and they had just played it. The treasurer, Mr. Ragavan, meanwhile, was already drafting the calculations, additional processing fees, administrative charges, and even potential legal expenses. Every rupee was a tool of intimidation, every figure an attempt to tighten the noose. And so, a campaign began. Notices slid under Arjun's door at odd hours. Emails flooded his inbox. The security guards, once casual acquaintances, now handed him envelopes with stiff, rehearsed politeness. Each message carried the same undertone: surrender or be crushed. Arjun, pressure seeped into every corner of his daily life. His neighbors, once indifferent, now seemed divided into camps. A few offered discreet nods of encouragement, but most chose silence, unwilling to draw the committee's ire. Others avoided eye contact altogether, treating him as though defiance were contagious. Even mundane routines became battlegrounds. When Arjun parked his car, he noticed security guards scribbling notes. When he walked through the lobby, he caught whispers cut short the moment he entered. He lived in his own home, yet felt like an intruder. At night, sleep eluded him. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of ceiling fans, replaying the committee's words in his head. Eviction, legal action, fines. The terms blurred together into a fog of anxiety. He wasn't just fighting a committee anymore. He was fighting a machine designed to wear him down until surrender became easier than resistance. But beneath the exhaustion, something else stirred: defiance. Arjun began collecting evidence. He photographed notices, recorded the placement of parcels in bins, gathered testimonies from neighbors about arbitrary fines. He pored over the housing laws of Bengaluru, searching for loopholes the committee had ignored. He read forums and news reports, discovering stories of other residents across India who had been bullied by housing associations. Some had fought back. Some had won. It was a lonely task, but it gave him purpose. Every shred of evidence was a shield. Every precedent, a weapon. If the committee wanted a war, then Arjun would not enter the battlefield empty-handed. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the complex darkened. At night, the glow of streetlights seemed harsher, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Conversations among residents took on a sharper tone. Rumors swirled, some claiming Arjun had deliberately provoked the committee, others suggesting he might be hiding something. Gossip grew, not because of truth, but because fear needed fuel. The committee thrived on this. Division meant control. If residents feared becoming the next Arjun, they would fall in line without protest. And yet, cracks began to appear. Mr. Pillai, the elderly resident who had spoken up at the meeting, started voicing his disapproval more openly. A young couple in Block B quietly admitted to Arjun that they too had been fined for absurd reasons, once for leaving a slipper outside their door, once for their maid placing garbage in the wrong bin. The more Arjun listened, the clearer the picture became. His fight wasn't just his. It was everyone's. Still, the committee was relentless. One evening, a courier arrived at his flat with a sealed envelope. Inside was an official-looking document stamped in bold ink. Preliminary eviction notice. It wasn't a court order. It had no real legal standing yet, but it was designed to terrify. And for a moment, it succeeded. Arjun sat on his sofa, the letter trembling in his hands, the walls of his flat suddenly feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. But as his fear settled, something sharper replaced it. Clarity. If they wanted to push him out, they would have to drag him out in the open. And when that happened, he would expose them for what they were. The next morning, he made a decision. Instead of hiding, he would fight in plain sight. He drafted a letter, not to the committee, but to every resident of the complex. He slipped copies under doors, posted one on the notice board where his name had been shamed before. The letter didn't beg. It didn't apologize. It laid out the facts, the baseless fines, the fabricated rules, the bullying tactics. It asked one simple question. If this can happen to me today, what stops it from happening to you tomorrow? By afternoon, the letter had ignited conversations everywhere. Some dismissed it as rebellion. Others whispered that he was right. And for the first time, the committee found themselves on the defensive. Not because they had lost power, but because they had lost silence. But Arjun also knew that exposing them within the society wasn't enough. He needed allies beyond these walls. So that evening, he reached out to a journalist friend he hadn't spoken to in years. He sent the documents, the notices, the photographs. He told the story. The journalist's reply was short, but it was enough. "This is bigger than you think?" Let me dig into it. Arjun closed his laptop, his pulse steady. The fight was no longer just within his apartment block. It was about to spill into the world outside. And the committee, for all their threats and posturing, had no idea what storm was coming. The next morning, the society gates no longer guarded just a cluster of flats. They guarded a story that was about to slip through their iron bars and spread far beyond their manicured lawns. It began with a single article. The journalist, Arjun, had published the piece online under the headline, "Bengaluru Housing Society Accused of Harassing Resident Over Parcel." It wasn't front-page news yet, but it didn't need to be. Within hours, the headline began bouncing across social media feeds. On Twitter, angry threads dissected the absurdity of a housing committee threatening eviction over a cardboard box. On Facebook, resident groups shared the story, warning that such authoritarian committees were becoming a menace across Indian cities. The comments section exploded. "This happened in our apartment too. Fined ours $2,000 because my child played cricket in the corridor." These committees behave like private governments, with zero accountability. Good on this man for fighting back. We need more people like him. By evening, the story had left the internet and reached television screens. Local news channels picked it up, eager for a controversy that resonated with middle-class families. Reporters framed the story not as one man's defiance, but as a symbol of a growing problem. HOAs acting as little dictatorships in modern urban India. Inside the complex, the mood shifted overnight. The same neighbors who once avoided eye contact now whispered updates with nervous excitement. Children ran around repeating lines they overheard from television anchors. The security guards, who once delivered notices with stiff formality, now exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whose orders to follow. And the committee? They felt the heat like never before. Mrs. Menon's phone buzzed relentlessly with calls from acquaintances, relatives, even strangers demanding to know what was happening. She prided herself on being a symbol of order and discipline. Yet here, she was, painted as the villain of a citywide scandal. The treasurer, Mr. Raghavan, panicked over the financial angle. If the media kept digging, they might discover the questionable fines collected over the years. What had once been a neat system of revenue disguised as discipline could now unravel into an embarrassing scandal, or worse, a legal investigation. For the first time, the committee met not in triumph, but in fear. Their power had always rested on silence, secrecy, and the residents' reluctance to question them. Now, with the spotlight of media glare, every decision they had ever made seemed like a potential weapon waiting to be turned against them. Meanwhile, Arjun walked through the society with a different energy. He wasn't triumphant, he was cautious. The attention was empowering, but it was also dangerous. He knew committees didn't crumble quietly. They retaliated, schemed, and tightened their grip. Still, something had changed. Neighbors approached. Him! Not all, but enough. A middle-aged woman from Block C confided that she too had been fined for keeping potted plants outside her door. A young father revealed that the committee had threatened to bar his maid because she parked her scooter near the gate. An elderly man whispered that his maintenance charges had mysteriously increased after he questioned the security contract. Each story, once hidden in private shame, now became part of a collective voice. For the first time, the residents began to see themselves not as scattered individuals, but as a community oppressed by its own supposed guardians. The news cycle intensified. Reporters showed up at the gates, cameras in hand, trying to get sound bites. One morning, A camera crew even stationed themselves outside the society, hoping to catch visuals of the now infamous notice board. Residents crowded their balconies, peering down like spectators in an amphitheater as microphones waved and shutters clicked. The committee tried damage control. They issued a bland statement. The society rules exist for the well-being of all residents. Misunderstandings can happen, but discipline is necessary for harmony. But the statement backfired. On TV panels, anchors mocked it as bureaucratic jargon. On social media, it was torn apart and memed within hours. One viral tweet read, "Imagine being evicted for ordering from Amazon. Bengaluru HOA committees are becoming North Korea leet." The more they tried to silence the storm, the louder it grew. And then came the turning point. One of the city's larger newspapers launched an investigation into housing societies across Bengaluru. Within days, they uncovered a trail of arbitrary fines, inflated maintenance charges, and unchecked authority in multiple complexes. Arjun's story was no longer an isolated dispute. It was the spark that ignited a larger fire. The authorities could no longer ignore it. A local MLA tweeted that residents' rights were important and promised to look into the matter. Lawyers began discussing legal loopholes that committees exploited. NGOs dealing with housing rights offered Arjun their support. Suddenly, the battle that once confined itself to a lobby board notice had transformed into a city-wide debate. But while Arjun felt vindicated, he also knew this was just the beginning. The committee wasn't beaten. They were cornered. And cornered opponents often fought back with desperation. Late one evening, as Arjun walked back from the gate, he noticed two committee members speaking in hushed tones near the clubhouse. Their expressions weren't panicked. They were calculating. Something was brewing. For all the exposure, all the noise, Arjun could feel it. The committee hadn't surrendered. They were plotting their next move, and he would need to be ready. The battle for one man's dignity had grown into a war over power itself. The storm had grown larger than anyone in that gated community had anticipated. What started as a single notice about a discarded parcel had spiraled into a city-wide debate about rights, power, and the unchecked authority of housing committees. But storms don't end with noise. They end when the wreckage is cleared, when one side is forced to yield. And the committee had no intention of yielding. Behind closed doors, the members gathered for what would be their most desperate meeting yet. The polished tables and bottled water no longer gave the sense of order they once enjoyed. Instead, the air was thick with panic and resentment. Mrs. Menon, red-eyed from sleepless nights, slammed her hand on the table. "This man has humiliated us," she declared, her voice trembling not with weakness, but with rage. "He has dragged our names through the mud, turned our respected community into a laughingstock. If we allow him to continue, we will lose everything." The treasurer nodded grimly. Their reputation had been shredded, their authority mocked. And while the outside world debated fairness, balance, and resident rights, all they cared about was one thing: control. So they plotted. Not with notices this time, but with paperwork, bylaws, and connections. The first strike came swiftly. A fresh notice appeared on Arjun's door, not about fines, but about his tenancy itself. According to an obscure clause buried in the society's handbook, residents who repeatedly bring disrepute to the community could face eviction procedures. The implication was clear. If he did not stop, they would throw him out. Neighbors whispered nervously in the corridors. Some wanted to stand by him, but the fear was real. If the committee could target him, what was stopping them from turning against others? Support, though growing outside, remained fragile within the gates. But Arjun was no longer alone. Lawyers had reached out, offering free counsel. Activists began visiting the society, handing out pamphlets on residents' rights. The once lonely man with a cardboard box was now a symbol. And symbols don't fall easily. He refused to take down the news clippings taped proudly to his door. He refused to remove the printouts of tweets supporting him. And most of all, he refused to bend. The final confrontation unfolded not in silence, but in public. One evening, the committee called for a special residents' meeting in the community hall. They expected compliance, the way they always had. Rows of plastic chairs were lined up, the microphone polished, the projector ready with slides. But what they hadn't expected was the turnout. Dozens of residents filled the hall, not with bowed heads, but with crossed arms and skeptical eyes. Some came with questions, others came with quiet anger, and a few came with cameras, ready to record. Mrs. Menon began with a speech about discipline, harmony, and community pride. She spoke of rules as the backbone of order. But this time, her words met not with applause, but with murmurs of doubt. A resident from Block C raised her hand. "Why was I fined for my flower pots? Where is that in the bylaws?" A father stood up. "Why were maids threatened for parking? Who gave you that power?" The questions multiplied. The microphones were no longer theirs alone. And for the first time, the committee was not feared. It was cornered. The climax came when Arjun stood. He didn't need anger. He didn't need theatrics. He simply pointed to the pile of notices he carried with him, a stack thick enough to slam on the table. "Like a book. This," he said, "is not order. This is harassment. And it ends now." The hall erupted, not in chaos, but in agreement. A ripple of nods, claps, and voices rising together. Residents who had suffered silently found courage in numbers. The committee, once all-powerful, now faced a rebellion not of one man, but of the very community they claimed to represent. The aftermath was swift. Under pressure from media scrutiny, resident backlash, and the looming threat of legal action, the committee was forced to step down. An interim body was elected, one that promised transparency and accountability. Mrs. Menon left the meeting without her usual authority. For years, she had ruled with rules, shaping the society into her image of control. Now, she was just another resident, stripped of the power she believed was hers by right. As for Arjun, he didn't claim victory as his own. He knew it wasn't about him anymore. It was about every resident who had ever been silenced, fined, or threatened for daring to live normally in their own home. His fight had become their fight, and together they had won. The society gates still stood, iron and imposing. The manicured lawns still gleamed. But something invisible had shifted. The fear was gone. The whispers had turned into voices. And, for the first time, the residents felt that the place they lived in truly belonged to them, not to a committee, not to a set of arbitrary rules, but to the people themselves. And in that victory, one thing became clear. Sometimes, a single discarded box can start a revolution.